On a stormy night, a single father finds a woman evicted from her boarding house, clutching soaking wet cardboard boxes outside. He invites her to stay in his empty guest room, a simple act of kindness. But this woman is none other than a billionaire on the run from her past. When her former landlord takes revenge by destroying his business, everything he's built for his son is on the verge of collapse. Can these two strangers protect each other before it all falls apart? Follow the story to the end, and comment with the city you're watching in to let me know how far this story has progressed. The rain came down in sheets that night, hammering the roof of Caleb Foster's workshop like it was trying to break through. He stood in the open garage doorway with his arms crossed, watching water pour off the gutters in thick streams. The air smelled like wet concrete and motor oil. Behind him, half-finished chair frames sat clamped on his workbench, waiting for morning when he could sand them smooth. His hands were still sore from the day's work, calluses rough against his thumbs. He should have been inside already. His son, Mason, was asleep upstairs, and Caleb had a rule about being in the house before 9. But something kept him there, standing in the threshold between the warm light of his shop and the storm outside. Maybe it was the noise. Maybe it was the way the rain made everything else disappear. Then he saw her. Across the driveway, just past the hedge that separated his property from the rental unit next door, a figure was struggling with a cardboard box. The box was soaked through, sagging in the middle, and the woman holding it looked like she was about to lose her grip. She set it down hard on the wet pavement, then turned back toward the front door of the unit. Caleb squinted through the rain. The door was open, and there was a man standing in the doorway. Tall, thick around the middle, arms folded. The woman said something Caleb couldn't hear, and the man shook his head. Then he stepped back inside and slammed the door. The sound of it carried even through the storm. The woman stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door like she was deciding whether to knock again. Then she bent down, picked up the box, and started walking toward the street. Caleb watched her go. She was wearing a long coat that was plastered to her back, her hair hanging in dark ropes over her shoulders. She moved like someone who was used to carrying heavy things, but her steps were uneven, like she was running on fumes. He shouldn't get involved. That was the smart move. He didn't know her, didn't know what kind of situation she was in. For all he knew, this was some kind of domestic thing, some argument between her and the landlord, not his business. But then she stumbled. The box hit the ground, and the bottom gave out. Books spilled across the wet pavement, pages fluttering open in the rain. The woman dropped to her knees and started grabbing at them, trying to gather them up, but the water was already soaking through. Caleb cursed under his breath and stepped out into the rain. By the time he reached her, she had an armful of soaked books pressed against her chest. She didn't look up at him, just kept reaching for more. "You need help," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. She glanced at him, and for a second he saw her face clearly. Mid-30s, maybe younger, sharp features, pale skin, eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in days. There was something fierce in the way she looked at him, like she was daring him to say the wrong thing. "I'm fine," she said. "You're not." She stood up, clutching the books. Water ran down her face, dripping off her chin. "I don't need your help." "Didn't say you did," Caleb said. "But you're going to lose everything you've got if you keep trying to carry it in the rain." She stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her deciding whether to tell him to go to hell. Then her shoulders sagged, just a little. "He locked me out," she said. "My landlord. He changed the locks while I was at work." Caleb looked past her at the rental unit. The lights were off now. "That's illegal." "I know." "You call the cops?" She laughed, but it was bitter. "And tell them what? That I'm behind on rent? They'll tell me it's a civil matter and leave." Caleb didn't argue. She was probably right. "How much stuff do you have left in there?" "Everything," she said. "Clothes, documents, my laptop. Everything." He looked at the pile of books on the ground, then back at her. "You got somewhere to go tonight?" She didn't answer. "I've got a guest unit," Caleb said. "Out back. It's not much, but it's dry." She shook her head immediately. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity. It's a roof." "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask you to." She looked at him like she was trying to figure out if he was serious. "Why would you do that?" Caleb shrugged. "Because it's raining and you don't have anywhere to go." For a moment he thought she was going to say no. Then she looked down at the books in her arms, pages falling apart in her hands, and something in her expression cracked, Okay, she said quietly. They didn't talk much as they gathered what was left of her things. Most of it was ruined, boxes that had dissolved, clothes that were soaked through, framed pictures with cracked glass. Caleb carried what he could, and she followed him across the yard to the small guest unit behind his house. It was barely more than a studio, just a bedroom, bathroom, and kitchenette, but it was clean and it had heat. He unlocked the door and flipped on the light. The woman stepped inside, dripping water onto the tile floor, and looked around like she was trying to convince herself this was real. Towels are in the closet, Caleb said. There's a space heater under the bed if you need it. She set the books down on the counter and turned to face him. Up close, he could see how exhausted she was. Her hands were shaking. Thank you, she said. Caleb nodded. You need anything else tonight? No. He started to leave, then stopped in the doorway. I'm Caleb, by the way. Caleb Foster. Vivian, she said. Vivian Sterling. The name didn't mean anything to him then. Caleb didn't sleep well that night. He kept thinking about the woman in his guest unit, wondering if he'd made the right call. He didn't know her. Didn't know what kind of trouble she might be in. And now she was 20 feet from his back door, with his son asleep upstairs. But when he'd seen her kneeling in the rain trying to save those books, he hadn't been able to walk away. He got up at 5:30, like he always did, and made coffee in the dark kitchen. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. Through the window he could see the guest unit. The lights were still off. At 6, Mason came downstairs in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. Morning, bud, Caleb said. Morning. Mason climbed onto one of the kitchen chairs and yawned. He was 7, all knees and elbows, with Caleb's dark hair and his mother's sharp chin. Is it a school day? Yeah, but we've got time. You want pancakes or cereal? Pancakes. Caleb got out the griddle and started mixing batter. Mason sat at the table with a coloring book, half asleep, his pencil moving in lazy circles across the page. Dad? Yeah? There's a car outside. Caleb looked up. Through the kitchen window, he could see a small sedan parked in the driveway. He'd missed it in the dark. That's our neighbor, Caleb said. She's staying in the guest unit for a little while. Mason frowned. We have a neighbor? As of last night? Why? Because she needed a place to stay. Mason thought about that for a moment, then went back to coloring. Caleb flipped the pancakes and tried not to think about how he was going to explain this if Vivian stuck around for more than a few days. At 7:15, there was a knock on the back door. Caleb opened it to find Vivian standing on the porch, wearing the same coat from the night before, now dry but wrinkled. She looked better in the daylight, still tired but steadier. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she had a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. Morning, she said. Morning. I wanted to thank you again for last night. You already did. She shifted her weight, glancing past him into the kitchen. I also wanted to let you know I'll be out of your way by the end of the week. I just need a few days to figure things out. Caleb nodded. Take whatever time you need. I mean it. I'm not going to overstay. I know. She looked like she wanted to say something else, but then Mason appeared in the doorway behind Caleb, holding a forkful of pancake. Hi, Mason said. Vivian blinked, clearly caught off guard. Hi. I'm Mason. I'm Vivian. Mason took a bite of pancake, still staring at her. Do you like pancakes? Yes, I do. My dad makes really good ones. Caleb put a hand on Mason's shoulder. Go finish your breakfast, bud. Mason wandered back to the table, and Vivian let out a breath that might have been a laugh. You didn't mention you had a kid, she said. Didn't seem relevant. It's relevant. Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he just stood there. Vivian looked at him for a moment, then nodded. I'll stay out of your way, she said. I promise. You don't have to. But she was already walking back toward the guest unit, her bag bouncing against her hip. The first few days were strange. Vivian kept to herself mostly. Caleb would see her leaving in the mornings, dressed in clothes that looked expensive even when they were wrinkled, and she wouldn't come back until late. He didn't ask where she was going, and she didn't offer. But sometimes in the evenings, he'd see her sitting on the porch of the guest unit with her laptop, staring at the screen like she was trying to solve a puzzle with no pieces. Once, he brought her a plate of leftovers, spaghetti and garlic bread, and she looked at him like he'd handed her something fragile. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know." She took the plate anyway. On the fourth night, Caleb was working late in the shop, finishing a commission for a dining table. It was past 10, and he was running the sander over the last rough edge when the door opened. Vivian stood in the doorway, backlit by the overhead lights in the yard. "You're still up," she said. "Could say the same about you." She stepped inside, looking around at the tools hanging on the walls, the stacks of lumber in the corner, the half-finished furniture scattered across the floor. "This is your workshop?" "Yeah." "You make all this?" "Most of it." She walked over to the dining table, running her hand along the edge. "It's beautiful." "It's not done yet." "Still." She looked at him. "How long have you been doing this?" "About 10 years. Started after Mason was born." "And before that?" "Construction, framing mostly." She nodded, like that made sense. "Do you sell these?" "When I can. Custom orders mostly. People want something specific, they come to me." "Do you make enough to live on?" Caleb set down the sander and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious." "We get by." Vivian didn't say anything for a moment. Then she leaned against the workbench and crossed her arms. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why did you help me?" Caleb thought about it. "Because you needed help." "That's it?" "That's it." She studied him like she was trying to decide if he was lying. "Most people wouldn't have done that." "Maybe." "You don't even know me." "No," Caleb said. "But I know what it's like to have nowhere to go." Vivian looked down at her hands. "I wasn't always like this," she said quietly. "A few months ago, I had an apartment in the city. A good job. I had my shit together." "What happened?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "It's a long story." "I've got time." But she didn't take the bait. Instead, she straightened up and gave him a small, tight smile. "Thanks for the food earlier. It was good." "Any time." She turned to leave, then stopped in the doorway. "Caleb?" "Yeah?" "I mean it. I'll be out of here soon. I'm not going to be a problem." "You're not a problem." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded and walked back out into the night. By the end of the first week, Vivian had started to settle in. She still left early and came back late, but now she'd wave when she saw Caleb in the yard, or stop to chat with Mason when he was playing outside. Mason liked her, which surprised Caleb. His son was usually shy around strangers, but Vivian had a way of talking to him that was straightforward and easy. She didn't talk down to him, didn't treat him like a little kid. One Saturday morning, Caleb found them sitting on the porch together, Vivian showing Mason something on her laptop. "What are you two up to?" Caleb asked. "Vivian's teaching me about constellations," Mason said, pointing at the screen. "Are you now?" Vivian glanced up at him. He asked what I was working on, and I said I was looking at satellite data. One thing led to another. "Satellite data? For work." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "What kind of work?" "Consulting," she said, which wasn't really an answer. Mason tugged on her sleeve. "Can you show me the one that looks like a bear?" "Ursa Major, sure." Caleb left them to it and went back to the shop, but the conversation stuck with him. Vivian didn't talk about her work, didn't talk about where she'd come from, and Caleb didn't push. But he was starting to realize that the woman staying in his guest unit wasn't just someone who'd fallen on hard luck. She was someone who'd been someone. That evening, after Mason was in bed, Caleb was sitting on the back porch with a beer when Vivian came out of the guest unit. She was wearing sweatpants and an oversized sweatshirt, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. "Can I sit?" she asked. "Go ahead." She settled into the chair next to him and looked out at the dark yard. For a while, neither of them said anything. "I owe you an explanation," Vivian said finally. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." She took a breath. "My landlord, the one who kicked me out, his name is Greg Mallory. I was renting from him for about 6 months. At first, everything was fine. Then he started showing up unannounced, letting himself in when I wasn't home, making comments." Caleb's jaw tightened. "What kind of comments?" "The kind that made it clear he thought the rent came with other expectations." "Jesus." "I told him to back off. He didn't like that. So he started finding excuses to make my life difficult. Maintenance requests that never got handled, complaints about noise that didn't exist. And then one day I came home and the locks were changed. Why didn't you fight it? I tried, but I didn't have the money for a lawyer and he knew it. He told me if I made a fuss, he'd make sure I couldn't rent anywhere else in the area. So I took what I could carry and left. Caleb stared at her. That's extortion. Yeah, it is. You should report him. To who? The cops won't do anything, and even if they did, he'd just find another way to screw me over. Caleb wanted to argue, but he couldn't. She was probably right. I'm sorry, he said. Vivian shrugged. It's not your problem. Maybe not, but it's still shitty. She smiled a little. Yeah, it is. They sat in silence for a while, the night air cool and still. Then Vivian turned to him. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why are you doing this, really? Caleb thought about it. I told you, you needed help. But why me? You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. He looked at her. Because a long time ago, someone helped me when I didn't have anywhere else to go, and I didn't forget that. Vivian didn't say anything, but something in her expression softened. Who was it? She asked. My boss. When I was doing construction, I just had Mason and his mom. He stopped, then started again. She left, just walked out one day and didn't come back. I was trying to figure out how to take care of a newborn and keep working, and I was failing at both. My boss let me bring Mason to the job site for a few months until I could afford daycare. Didn't have to, but he did. That's a good boss. Yeah, he was. Vivian looked down at her hands. I used to think I had everything figured out, she said. I had money, a career, a plan. I thought if I worked hard enough, I could control everything. But then it all fell apart, and I realized I didn't control anything. I was just lucky. And when the luck ran out, so did everything else. You'll figure it out, Caleb said. You don't know that. No, but I know you're still here. That counts for something. She met his eyes, and for the first time since she'd shown up in the rain, she smiled. Not a polite smile or a tired one. A real one. Thanks, she said. Anytime. They stayed there for a while longer, talking about nothing and everything, until the cold drove them both inside. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm. Vivian started contributing to the household in small ways, buying groceries, cooking dinner a few nights a week, helping Mason with his homework. Caleb tried to tell her she didn't have to, but she ignored him. I'm not a freeloader, she said one night, standing at his stove and stirring a pot of soup. I never said you were. You're thinking it. I'm not. She gave him a look, and he shut up. Mason loved having her around. She'd sit with him in the evenings and read to him or play board games that Caleb had no patience for. And she was good with him, better than Caleb expected. She didn't baby him, didn't try to replace anyone. She was just there. Caleb tried not to think too hard about how much he liked having her there too. But then, 3 weeks in, everything changed. Caleb was in the shop one afternoon when a man in a suit showed up at the door. Caleb Foster? The man asked. That's me. The man handed him an envelope. You've been served. Caleb opened it and scanned the contents. It was a zoning complaint, filed with the city. Someone was claiming that his workshop violated residential zoning laws and needed to be shut down. The name on the complaint was Greg Mallory. Caleb stared at the paper, his stomach sinking. What is it? Vivian's voice came from behind him. He turned. She was standing in the doorway holding a bag of groceries. It's your landlord, Caleb said. He's trying to shut me down. Vivian set the groceries down on the workbench and took the paper from Caleb's hands. Her eyes moved quickly across the text, and he watched her face go from confused to furious in about 3 seconds. That son of a bitch, she said. You know him better than I do. Is this something he'd actually follow through on? Yes. She looked up at Caleb. Greg doesn't let things go. If he thinks I embarrassed him by leaving, he'll find a way to hurt me. And since he can't get to me directly anymore, he's going after you. Caleb took the paper back and read it again, slower this time. The complaint claimed his workshop was operating as a commercial business in a residential zone without proper permits. It demanded an immediate inspection and threatened fines if he didn't cease operations. I have permits, Caleb said. I got everything approved when I built the shop. That might not matter. If he filed the complaint, the city has to investigate. And even if you're clean, the process could take months. Can you afford to shut down for months? Caleb didn't answer. They both knew he couldn't. Vivian folded her arms across her chest, staring at the paper like she could set it on fire with her eyes. This is my fault. No, it's not. Yes, it is. He's doing this because of me. Because I'm staying here. He's doing this because he's an asshole, Caleb said. That's not on you. Caleb, I mean it. You didn't make him file this complaint. He did that all on his own. Vivian looked like she wanted to argue, but she just pressed her lips together and looked away. Caleb could see the guilt written all over her face, and it pissed him off. Not at her. At Mallory. At the whole situation. I need to call my lawyer, Caleb said. You have a lawyer? I have a guy who does contracts and business stuff. Never needed him for something like this. Vivian nodded. Call him. But Caleb, if this gets expensive, I'll figure it out. I'm serious. If you need help, I said I'll figure it out. The words came out harder than he meant them to, and Vivian flinched. Caleb exhaled and rubbed his face with both hands. Sorry, he said. I'm not mad at you. I know. I just need to think. Vivian picked up the groceries and headed toward the door. I'll give you some space. After she left, Caleb stood there for a long time, staring at the complaint in his hands. Everything he'd built was in this shop. The tables, the chairs, the custom cabinets that kept food on the table and paid Mason's school fees. If the city shut him down, even temporarily, he'd lose clients. And once you lost clients, they didn't always come back. He pulled out his phone and called his lawyer. The conversation didn't make him feel any better. The lawyer, a guy named Phil, who Caleb had used maybe twice in 10 years, told him the complaint was legitimate enough to trigger an inspection. Even if Caleb's permits were in order, the process would take time. Weeks, maybe months. And if Mallory had any connections at the city, he could drag it out even longer. Can I countersue? Caleb asked. For what? Filing a complaint isn't illegal, even if it's motivated by spite. Unless you can prove he's harassing you, there's not much you can do except wait it out and hope the inspection goes your way. And if it doesn't? Phil hesitated. Then you'll have to shut down until you get everything sorted. Could take 6 months, maybe longer. Caleb hung up and sat down on the edge of his workbench. His hands were shaking. 6 months. He wouldn't survive 6 months without income. He had some savings, but not enough, not even close. The door to the shop opened again, and Caleb looked up, expecting Vivian. But it was Mason, still in his school clothes, backpack slung over one shoulder. Hey, bud, Caleb said, trying to keep his voice steady. How was school? Okay? Mason dropped his backpack on the floor and climbed up onto the stool next to Caleb. You look sad. I'm fine. You don't look fine, Caleb managed to smile. Just grown-up stuff. Nothing you need to worry about. Mason didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. Instead, he reached over and patted Caleb on the arm, the same way Caleb did to him when he was upset. It's okay, Dad, Mason said. Whatever it is, it'll be okay. Caleb pulled his son into a hug and held on a little longer than usual. That night, after Mason was asleep, Caleb sat on the back porch with a beer he wasn't really drinking. The air was cold and he could see his breath, but he didn't feel like going inside yet. The door to the guest unit opened and Vivian stepped out. She was wearing a heavy sweater and pajama pants, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She crossed the yard and sat down in the chair next to him without asking. For a while, neither of them said anything. I talked to my lawyer, Caleb said finally. And? And there's not much I can do except wait for the inspection and hope it goes well. When's the inspection? They haven't scheduled it yet. Could be next week, could be next month. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I can help. How? I know people. People who know how the city works. I can make some calls, see if I can speed things up, or at least make sure the inspection is fair. Caleb looked at her. What kind of people? Does it matter? Yeah, it does, Vivian sighed. I used to work in corporate development. Acquisitions, mostly. Part of my job was navigating regulatory issues and dealing with local governments. I'm good at it. Used to? I left that job a few months ago. Why? She didn't answer right away. Then she said, because I got tired of doing things I wasn't proud of. Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Let me help, Vivian said. Please, I can at least find out who's handling your case and make sure they're not dragging their feet. And if Mallory finds out you're involved, then he finds out. I don't care. He'll just come after you harder. Good. Let him try. Caleb studied her face in the dim light from the porch. She looked determined, but there was something else there too. Anger, maybe. Or guilt. He couldn't tell. I don't want you doing anything that's going to blow back on you, Caleb said. It won't. You don't know that. Neither do you. She had a point. Fine, Caleb said. Make your calls. But if this gets messy, I want you to back off. Deal? Deal. They sat there a little longer, and then Vivian stood up and stretched. Get some sleep, Caleb. You look like hell. Thanks. Anytime. She walked back toward the guest unit, and Caleb watched her go. He still didn't know who she really was or what she'd left behind. But he was starting to realize that whatever it was, it had weight. The next morning, Vivian was up before Caleb. When he came downstairs, she was already at the kitchen table with her laptop open and her phone pressed to her ear. She held up a finger when she saw him, signaling him to wait. No, I understand that, she was saying, but I need to know who's assigned to the case. Can you at least tell me that much? She listened for a moment, then wrote something down on a notepad. Thank you. I appreciate it. She hung up and looked at Caleb. The inspection is scheduled for next Thursday, 9 a.m. How did you find that out? I called the zoning department and told them I was your business partner. Are you? As of this morning, yes. At least on paper. Caleb poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. You didn't have to do that. I know, but it gives me standing to ask questions and get information. It also means I can be there during the inspection. Vivian, don't argue with me. I'm doing this whether you like it or not. Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no point in arguing. She'd already made up her mind. Fine, he said, but you're not paying for anything. I wasn't planning to, and if this turns into a legal fight, I'm handling it. Okay? I mean it. I said okay. Mason came downstairs then, rubbing his eyes and yawning. He looked at Vivian, then at Caleb, then back at Vivian. Are you guys fighting? He asked. No, Caleb and Vivian said at the same time. Mason didn't look convinced, but he shrugged and went to get cereal. Vivian gave Caleb a look that said, we'll talk about this later, and went back to her laptop. The week leading up to the inspection was tense. Caleb spent every spare moment going through his paperwork, making sure everything was in order. He pulled out old permits, receipts, inspection reports from when he'd first built the shop. He even dug up the original zoning approval from the county, just in case. Vivian, meanwhile, was making calls. Lots of them. Caleb would walk past the guest unit at night and see her through the window, pacing back and forth with her phone to her ear. He didn't ask who she was talking to. He figured it was better not to know. On Tuesday, 2 days before the inspection, Vivian showed up at the shop with a folder full of documents. What's this? Caleb asked. Everything the city has on file about your property. Zoning records, building permits, tax assessments. I pulled it all this morning. Caleb flipped through the folder. How did you get this? Public records request. Anyone can do it. In 2 days? I know a guy. Caleb looked at her. You know a lot of guys. I used to anyway. He set the folder down and leaned against the workbench. Can I ask you something? Sure. Who are you really? Because I'm starting to think you're not just someone who fell on hard times. Vivian crossed her arms and looked at him for a long moment. Then she sighed. My full name is Vivian Sterling, she said. 5 years ago, I was the vice president of acquisitions at Hargrave Capital. We bought and sold companies, mostly tech startups, some real estate. I was good at it, really good. I made a lot of money for a lot of people, and I made a lot for myself, too. Caleb just stared at her. Then I found out we were buying up affordable housing properties and flipping them into luxury condos, Vivian continued, displacing families, jacking up rents, all in the name of maximizing returns. I raised concerns with my boss. He told me to keep quiet and do my job. So I quit. Just like that? Just like that. And when I quit, I burned a lot of bridges. People in my industry don't like whistleblowers, even quiet ones. I got blacklisted pretty fast. Couldn't find work anywhere that wasn't shady as hell. So I took what savings I had left and tried to start over. That lasted about 6 months before I ran out of money and ended up renting from Greg Mallory. Caleb didn't know what to say. Why didn't you tell me any of this before? Because it doesn't matter. That version of me is gone. I'm not her anymore. You sure about that? Because you're acting an awful lot like someone who knows how to fight. Vivian smiled, but it was sad. Old habits die hard. I'm not complaining. You should be. I brought this mess to your door. No, Caleb said. Mallory brought this mess to my door. You're just helping me deal with it. Vivian looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she handed him the folder. Look through this tonight. Make sure everything matches what you've got. If there are any discrepancies, we need to know before Thursday. Okay. She started to leave, then stopped. Caleb? Yeah? Thank you for not throwing me out after you found out. Why would I do that? Because most people would. I'm not most people. Vivian smiled, this time a real one, and walked back toward the house. Thursday morning came too fast. Caleb was up at 5, too anxious to sleep. He made coffee, went over his paperwork for the 100th time, and tried not to think about what would happen if the inspection didn't go well. Mason was still asleep, and Caleb was grateful for that. He didn't want his son to see how worried he was. At 8:30, Vivian knocked on the door to the shop. She was dressed in black slacks and a crisp white blouse, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked every inch the businesswoman she used to be. You ready? She asked. As I'll ever be. Good, because the inspector just pulled up. Caleb's stomach dropped. The inspector was a middle-aged woman with short gray hair and a clipboard. She introduced herself as Linda Marsh and shook hands with both Caleb and Vivian before walking around the shop. She didn't say much, just took notes and measured things and asked to see Caleb's permits. Caleb handed them over and tried not to look nervous. Linda flipped through the paperwork, then looked up at him. These permits are for a personal workshop, not a commercial operation. That's correct, Vivian said before Caleb could answer. Mr. Foster operates a custom furniture business as a sole proprietor. Under City Code Section 14.3, that qualifies as a home-based business, which is permitted in residential zones as long as it doesn't create excessive noise, traffic, or nuisance to neighbors. Linda looked at Vivian. And you are? Vivian Sterling. I'm Mr. Foster's business partner. I see. Linda made a note on her clipboard. Have there been any complaints from neighbors about noise or traffic? No, Caleb said. None on file, Vivian added. The only complaint is from Greg Mallory, who doesn't live in this neighborhood and has no legal standing to file a zoning complaint. Linda's eyebrows went up. Is that so? It is. Mr. Mallory is a private landlord who operates rental properties 3 miles from here. He has no business interest in this area and no legitimate reason to be concerned about Mr. Foster's operation. The complaint appears to be retaliatory in nature. Linda looked at Vivian for a long moment, then back at Caleb. Is that true? Caleb hesitated. He didn't want to drag Vivian into this any more than she already was. But Vivian gave him a look that said, "Trust me." Yeah, Caleb said. It's true. Mallory and I have a personal issue. He's using the zoning complaint to get back at me. Linda made another note. What kind of personal issue? He illegally evicted Ms. Sterling from one of his properties, Caleb said. She's been staying with me while she gets back on her feet. He didn't like that. Linda looked between them, then down at her clipboard. I'm going to need to verify a few things, she said, but based on what I'm seeing here, your permits are in order. You're running a legitimate home-based business, and there's no evidence of code violations. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest. So I'm clear? Provisionally. I'll file my report with the city, and they'll make a final determination. But unless something changes, I don't see any reason to shut you down. How long will that take? A few weeks. Maybe less. Vivian stepped forward. And in the meantime, Mr. Foster can continue operating? Yes. There's no immediate danger or violation, so there's no reason to cease operations. Caleb wanted to hug her. He settled for shaking her hand instead. Thank you. Linda nodded and started packing up her things, but before she left, she turned back to Vivian. You're very well informed about city code, Linda said. I do my homework. Clearly. Linda smiled, just a little, and walked out. As soon as she was gone, Caleb turned to Vivian. How the hell did you know all that? I told you, I used to do this for a living. That was more than just knowing the code. You completely shut down Mallory's complaint. Because it was bullshit, Vivian said. He doesn't have standing, and Linda knew it. I just made sure she couldn't ignore it. Caleb shook his head. You're terrifying. Thank you. They stood there for a moment, and then Caleb started laughing. He couldn't help it. The relief was too much. Vivian grinned. What? Nothing. Just thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you. You would have figured it out. Maybe, but it wouldn't have been as fast. Vivian's smile faded a little. I'm just glad I could help. You did more than help. You saved my ass. Let's not celebrate yet. We still have to wait for the final report. Yeah, but Linda said I could keep working. That's what matters. Vivian nodded, but Caleb could see the worry still lingering in her eyes. She didn't trust that this was over. And honestly, neither did he. That night, after Mason was in bed, Caleb opened a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. He poured 2 glasses and carried them out to the back porch, where Vivian was already sitting. Thought you might want this, he said, handing her a glass. What are we celebrating? Not being shut down. Fair enough. She took a sip and made a face. That's strong. It's good whiskey. If you say so. They sat in silence for a while, the night air cool and still. Caleb could hear crickets in the distance and the faint hum of traffic from the main road. Can I ask you something? Vivian said. Sure. Why do you do this? The furniture, I mean. You could probably make more money doing something else. Caleb thought about it. I like making things, he said. When I was doing construction, I was just following blueprints, building what someone else designed. But with this, I get to create something from scratch, something that's mine. Is that important to you, having something that's yours? Yeah, it is. Vivian nodded, like that made sense. I get that. Do you miss it? Caleb asked. Your old job? Sometimes. Not the job itself, but the feeling of being good at something, of knowing what I was doing. You're still good at things. You proved that today. That was different. That was just research and bullshit. It was more than that, and you know it. Vivian looked down at her glass. Maybe. They finished their drinks in silence, and then Vivian stood up to leave. But before she went inside, she turned back to Caleb. I meant what I said earlier, she told him, about this being my fault. If Mallory comes after you again, I'll leave. I won't let him destroy what you've built. He's not going to destroy anything. You don't know that. Neither do you, so stop talking like you're already gone. Vivian looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Okay. Okay. She went inside, and Caleb sat there a little longer, staring out at the dark yard. He didn't know what was going to happen next. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like maybe they had a shot at getting through this. The next few days were quieter. Caleb went back to work on his commissions, and Vivian went back to whatever it was she did on her laptop all day. Mason went to school, came home, did his homework, and played in the yard. Everything felt normal, but Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for the other shoe to drop. It came on Monday afternoon. Caleb was in the shop, sanding down the legs of a coffee table, when his phone rang. It was Phil, his lawyer. Hey, Caleb said. What's up? We've got a problem. Caleb's stomach sank. What kind of problem? Mallory filed an appeal. He's claiming the inspector didn't conduct a thorough review and demanding a second inspection. Can he do that? Technically, yes. Anyone can file an appeal. It doesn't mean it'll go anywhere, but it does mean the city has to review it. How long will that take? Could be a few weeks. Could be longer. Caleb closed his eyes and leaned against the workbench. This is never going to end, is it? It will. But you need to be patient, and you need to be ready for the possibility that Mallory's going to keep pushing until he runs out of options. Or until I do. Phil didn't argue. After Caleb hung up, he just stood there for a while, staring at the half-finished table in front of him. He wanted to hit something. He wanted to call Mallory and tell him to go to hell. But he didn't. He just picked up the sandpaper and kept working. Later that night, Vivian found him in the shop. She didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway and watched him work. I heard, she said finally. Yeah, I'm sorry. Not your fault. It feels like it is. Caleb set down the sandpaper and turned to face her. Vivian, if you apologize one more time, I'm going to lose my mind. Then what do you want me to do? I want you to stop acting like you're the villain here. You're not. Mallory is, and I'm not going to let him win. Vivian crossed her arms. You can't fight him forever, Caleb. He has money. He has lawyers. He has time. What do you have? I have this. Caleb gestured around the shop. I have Mason, and I have you, unless you're planning on leaving. I'm not. Then we'll figure it out, together. Vivian looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she walked over and sat down on the edge of the workbench. You know what the worst part is? She said. What? I used to be like him. Not exactly, but close enough. I spent years putting profits over people, and I told myself it was just business, that it didn't matter as long as the numbers looked good, but it did matter, and now I'm on the other side of it, and I don't know how to fix it. You're already fixing it, Caleb said, by being here, by helping. That's not enough. It is to me. Vivian looked at him, and for a moment Caleb thought she might cry, but she didn't. She just nodded and looked away. They stayed there for a while, not talking, just sitting together in the quiet. And for the first time since the complaint had been filed, Caleb felt like maybe they really would get through this. But he also knew that the fight was far from over. The appeal dragged on for 3 weeks, and every day felt longer than the last. Caleb kept working, kept taking orders, kept pretending everything was fine. But the uncertainty was eating at him. He'd wake up at 4 in the morning and lie there staring at the ceiling, running through worst-case scenarios in his head. What if the second inspection went differently? What if they found something wrong that Linda had missed? What if Mallory had connections at the city who could make this all disappear in his favor? Mason noticed, even though Caleb tried to hide it. Are you mad at me? Mason asked one morning over breakfast. Caleb looked up from his coffee. What? No. Why would you think that? You've been quiet. I've just got a lot on my mind, bud. Work stuff. Is it bad work stuff? It's complicated work stuff. Mason pushed his cereal around with his spoon, not eating. Vivian said you're having trouble with a mean man. Caleb shot a look toward the guest unit, visible through the kitchen window. She told you that? I asked her why you were sad. She said it wasn't her place to tell me, but then I kept asking, and she said there's a mean man trying to cause problems. Is that true? Caleb set down his mug and rubbed his face. He didn't want to lie, but he also didn't want to scare his kid. Yeah, he said. There's a guy who's being difficult, but it's going to be okay. How do you know? Because I'm not going to let it not be okay. Mason thought about that for a moment, then nodded like that made perfect sense. Okay. Okay. Can I have more cereal? Sure. Later that day, Caleb found Vivian in the yard, sitting on the back steps with her laptop balanced on her knees. She was wearing jeans and a sweater that looked about 2 sizes too big, her hair loose around her shoulders. You told Mason about Mallory? Caleb asked. Vivian looked up, startled. He asked. I didn't know what to say. You could have told him to ask me. I did. But he's 7, Caleb. He's not stupid. He knows something's wrong. Caleb sat down next to her on the steps. I know. I just didn't want him worrying about it. He's going to worry anyway. At least now he knows it's not something he did. Caleb sighed. Yeah, you're probably right. They sat in silence for a moment, and then Vivian closed her laptop and set it aside. I've been thinking, she said. About what? About how to deal with Mallory. Vivian, just hear me out. The appeal process is slow, we both know that. But what if we didn't wait for the city to make a decision? What if we went after him directly? Caleb frowned. What do you mean, go after him? I mean find out what he's hiding. Because trust me, a guy like Mallory doesn't stay clean. He's cutting corners somewhere, and if we can find out where, we can use it against him. That sounds like blackmail. It's not blackmail, it's leverage. That's the same thing. No, it's not. Blackmail is threatening to expose someone unless they pay you. Leverage is just making sure they know you have the information. They decide what to do with it. Caleb looked at her. Have you done this before? Once or twice. And it worked? Every time. Caleb didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to tell her no, that they should just wait for the system to work. But the other part of him knew the system wasn't designed for people like him. It was designed for people like Mallory, People with money and time and lawyers who could drag things out until everyone else gave up. What would we even be looking for? Caleb asked. Building code violations, tenant complaints, financial records, anything that shows he's not operating above board. And I guarantee he's not. Guys like him never are. How do we get access to that stuff? Public records mostly. Some of it might require a little digging, but nothing illegal. Caleb rubbed his jaw, thinking. If we do this and he finds out, he's going to come after us even harder. He's already coming after us as hard as he can, Vivian said. What's he going to do, file another complaint? Let him. We'll be ready. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. There was something fierce in her eyes, something that reminded him this wasn't just about his workshop anymore. This was personal for her too. Okay, he said. Let's do it. Vivian smiled, sharp and determined. Good. I'll start pulling records tomorrow. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what Vivian had said, about going after Mallory directly. It felt dangerous, but it also felt like the only option they had left. Around midnight, he gave up on sleep and went downstairs to make tea. He was standing at the stove waiting for the water to boil when he heard a knock on the back door. It was Vivian, wearing sweatpants and a jacket, her hair pulled up in a messy ponytail. Couldn't sleep either? Caleb asked. Not really. She stepped inside and looked around the kitchen. Is that tea? Yeah, you want some? Sure. Caleb poured 2 mugs and handed her one. They stood there in the dim light of the stove, not saying anything for a while. I keep thinking about what you said earlier, Vivian said finally. About this being blackmail. I shouldn't have said that. No, you were right. It's a gray area, and I've spent enough time in gray areas to know they don't always lead somewhere good. So what are you saying? I'm saying if we do this, we need to be smart about it. We can't just go digging through his life and hope we find something. We need a plan. Okay, so what's the plan? Vivian set down her mug and leaned against the counter. First, we pull every public record we can find on him. Property records, business licenses, court filings. Then we look for patterns. If he's screwing over tenants, there's going to be a trail. Complaints, lawsuits, maybe even criminal charges. And if we find something, then we figure out how to use it, quietly, if possible. The goal isn't to destroy him. It's just to make him go away. Caleb took a sip of his tea. It was too hot, and it burned his tongue, but he didn't care. You really think this is going to work? He asked. I think it's our best shot. And if it doesn't? Vivian looked at him, and for the first time since she'd moved into the guest unit, Caleb saw something vulnerable in her expression. Then we'll figure out plan B, she said. The next morning, Vivian was up before dawn, already at her laptop when Caleb came downstairs. She had a notepad next to her, covered in handwriting, and her screen was filled with what looked like spreadsheets. Did you sleep at all? Caleb asked. A little. I got a head start on the records. And Mallory owns 12 rental properties in the area. All of them are listed under different LLCs, which is a red flag right there. He's hiding something. How do you know? Because that's what people do when they don't want their assets connected. It makes it harder to sue them if something goes wrong. Caleb poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. What else? I found 3 lawsuits filed against him in the past 5 years. 2 were settled out of court, 1 was dismissed. All of them were from tenants claiming illegal eviction or unsafe living conditions. Can we use that? Maybe. Depends on the details. I'm going to request the case files today and see what's in them. How long will that take? A few days, probably. Caleb nodded. Okay, keep me posted. Vivian looked up at him. You're handling this better than I expected. What do you mean? I thought you'd be more hesitant about all this, about going after him. Caleb shrugged. I was, but you're right. If we don't do something, he's just going to keep coming, and I'm tired of waiting for him to make the next move. Vivian smiled. Good, because we're going to need that attitude. Over the next few days, Vivian turned the guest unit into something that looked like a war room. She had papers spread out across every surface, her laptop constantly open, her phone always in her hand. Caleb would check in on her between projects, and every time he did, she had something new to show him. A complaint from a tenant who'd been locked out without warning. A building inspection report showing code violations at one of Mallory's properties. A court filing where Mallory had been sued for refusing to return a security deposit. This guy's a piece of work, Caleb said, looking through the files. That's putting it mildly. So what do we do with all this? We wait for the case files from the lawsuits. Those are going to have the details we need. Once we have those, we can start putting together a timeline, show a pattern of behavior. And then what? Then we present it to the city. Show them that Mallory isn't just some concerned citizen filing a legitimate complaint. He's a slumlord with a history of retaliating against people who cross him. You think they'll care? I think they'll have to, especially if we can prove he's filing complaints in bad faith. Caleb wanted to believe her, but he'd seen enough of how the world worked to know that guys like Mallory didn't go down easy. A week later, the case files arrived. Vivian spent an entire day going through them, highlighting passages and making notes. When she finally came out of the guest unit, she looked exhausted but triumphant. "I found it," she said. "Found what?" "The pattern." All three lawsuits are basically the same story. Mallory raises the rent, the tenant can't afford it, and he evicts them. But he doesn't go through the proper legal channels. He just changes the locks and throws their stuff out. And when they sue, he settles for just enough to make them go away without admitting guilt. That's illegal, right? Extremely. And if we can show the city that he's been doing this for years, it's going to be a lot harder for them to take his complaint seriously. Caleb felt something like hope starting to build in his chest. So what's our next move? We take all of this to the city zoning office. We request a meeting with whoever's handling the appeal, and we lay it all out. Show them that Mallory doesn't have clean hands. When? As soon as possible. I already put in a request for a meeting. We should hear back in a day or two. Caleb pulled her into a hug before he could stop himself. Vivian stiffened for a second, then relaxed and hugged him back. "Thank you," Caleb said. "Don't thank me yet. We still have to convince them." "We will." Vivian pulled back and looked up at him. "You sound pretty confident." "That's because I've got you on my side." She smiled, and for a moment something passed between them that Caleb couldn't quite name. Then Vivian stepped back and cleared her throat. "I should get cleaned up," she said. "I've been wearing the same sweatpants for 2 days." "That's disgusting." "I know." She went back to the guest unit, and Caleb stood there in the yard, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The meeting with the city was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Caleb spent the weekend going over everything Vivian had compiled, making sure he understood all of it. He didn't want to walk into that meeting unprepared. This was his one shot to shut Mallory down, and he wasn't going to waste it. On Monday night, the night before the meeting, Vivian came over for dinner. Caleb made spaghetti, and Mason talked her ear off about a science project he was working on. It felt normal, easy, like they were a family. After Mason went to bed, Caleb and Vivian sat on the back porch, going over their notes one last time. "You ready for tomorrow?" Vivian asked. "I think so. Are you?" "Yeah, I've done this kind of thing before, just not for something that mattered this much." Caleb looked at her. "What do you mean?" "When I was at Hargrave, I'd go into these meetings with city officials all the time, convince them to approve zoning changes or waive regulations. I was good at it, but it was always for someone else's profit. This is different." "How so?" "Because this time, it actually matters. If we lose tomorrow, you lose your livelihood. That's real. That's not just numbers on a spreadsheet." Caleb reached over and took her hand. "We're not going to lose." "You don't know that." "Yeah, I do, because we've got the truth on our side, and that's got to count for something." Vivian squeezed his hand but didn't say anything. They sat there for a while longer, and then she stood up to leave. "Get some sleep," she said. "We've got a long day tomorrow." "You too." She started to walk away, then stopped and turned back. "Caleb?" "Yeah?" "Thank you for letting me do this, for trusting me." "I wouldn't be here without you." "Yes, you would. You're stronger than you think." Before Caleb could respond, she was gone, disappearing into the guest unit and closing the door behind her. The next morning, they both dressed like they meant business. Caleb wore the one suit he owned, a charcoal gray thing he'd bought for a funeral 5 years ago and hadn't worn since. Vivian wore a navy blue dress and heels, her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. She looked like the vice president she used to be. They drove to City Hall in Caleb's truck, neither of them saying much. The weight of what they were about to do hung heavy between them. The zoning office was on the third floor, a maze of cubicles and filing cabinets. A receptionist directed them to a conference room where a man in his 50s was waiting. He introduced himself as Richard Holbrook, the senior zoning administrator. "Thank you for meeting with us," Vivian said, shaking his hand. "Of course. Though I have to say this is unusual. Most appeals don't warrant an in-person meeting." "We appreciate you making an exception," Caleb said. They sat down, and Vivian pulled out the folder she'd prepared. She handed Richard a copy and kept one for herself. "What you're looking at," Vivian said, "is a comprehensive history of Greg Mallory's conduct as a landlord. As you'll see, Mr. Mallory has been sued 3 times in the past 5 years for illegal eviction practices. He has a documented pattern of locking tenants out without proper notice, refusing to return security deposits, and retaliating against anyone who challenges him." Richard flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. "Now," Vivian continued, "Mr. Mallory filed a zoning complaint against Mr. Foster, claiming his workshop is in violation of residential zoning laws. But as the initial inspection confirmed, Mr. Foster is operating a legitimate home-based business with all proper permits. The only reason Mr. Mallory filed this complaint is because he's retaliating against Mr. Foster for providing housing to me, one of Mr. Mallory's former tenants." Richard looked up. "Can you prove that?" "Yes. I was illegally evicted from one of Mr. Mallory's properties 2 months ago. Mr. Foster offered me temporary housing, and within weeks, Mr. Mallory filed the complaint. The timing isn't a coincidence." Richard set down the folder and folded his hands on the table. "This is certainly compelling, but retaliation is difficult to prove. Mr. Mallory could argue he had legitimate concerns about the workshop." "He could," Vivian said, "but he doesn't live in the neighborhood. He has no property near Mr. Foster's home. He has no standing to file a zoning complaint in the first place." "That's not entirely true. Any resident can file a complaint." "But not in bad faith," Caleb said. "And that's what this is. He's using the system to harass me because he's angry at Vivian. That's abuse of process." Richard was quiet for a long moment, looking between them. Then he picked up the folder again and flipped through it more slowly. "These lawsuits," he said, "were any of them successful?" "2 were settled out of court," Vivian said. "One was dismissed on a technicality. But the pattern is clear. Mr. Mallory operates outside the law, and when he gets caught, he settles to avoid accountability." Richard closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "I'll be honest with you, this doesn't look good for Mr. Mallory. But it also doesn't change the fact that his complaint triggered a legitimate review process. I can't just ignore that." "We're not asking you to ignore it," Vivian said. "We're asking you to consider the source. If Mr. Mallory has a history of filing complaints in bad faith, that's relevant to how you evaluate this one. And what do you want me to do with this information?" "Deny the appeal," Caleb said. "The first inspection cleared me. There's no reason to drag this out any longer." Richard looked at Caleb, then at Vivian, then back at the folder. "I'll review this and make a recommendation to the board, but I can't promise anything." "That's all we're asking," Vivian said. They stood up, shook hands, and left. Outside in the parking lot, Caleb let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "How do you think it went?" he asked. "Better than I expected. Richard's not an idiot. He saw what we were showing him. But will he do anything about it?" "I don't know, but we did everything we could." They got in the truck and drove back in silence. When they pulled into the driveway, Vivian turned to Caleb. "Whatever happens," she said, "we did the right thing." "I know." "I mean it. Even if this doesn't work, we stood up to him. That matters." Caleb looked at her, at the determination in her eyes, and he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about the workshop anymore. It wasn't even just about Mallory. It was about the fact that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't facing his problems alone. "Yeah," he said, "it does." They got out of the truck and walked toward the house. Mason was waiting on the porch, waving at them. "How'd it go?" he called out. "Good," Caleb said. "Really good." And for the first time in weeks, he actually believed it. 3 days later, Caleb got the call. He was in the shop, working on a bookshelf commission, when his phone rang. It was Richard Holbrook from the zoning office. "Mr. Foster," Richard said, "I wanted to let you know that we've made a decision on the appeal." Caleb's heart was pounding. "And?" The appeal has been denied. The original inspection stands. You're clear to continue operating. Caleb had to sit down. Are you serious? Yes. After reviewing the information you and Ms. Sterling provided, we determined that Mr. Mallory's complaint was filed in bad faith. We're also forwarding our findings to the city attorney's office for further review of Mr. Mallory's conduct. What does that mean? It means he may face consequences for abusing the complaint process, but that's out of my hands. Thank you, Caleb said. Thank you so much. You're welcome. And Mr. Foster, you've got a good business there. Keep up the good work. Caleb hung up and just sat there for a moment, letting it sink in. Then he got up and ran to the guest unit, pounding on the door. Vivian opened it, looking alarmed. What's wrong? We won, Caleb said. They denied the appeal. We won. Vivian's eyes went wide. Are you serious? Yeah, Richard just called. It's over. For a second, Vivian just stared at him. Then she threw her arms around his neck and hugged him so hard he almost lost his balance. I can't believe it, she said into his shoulder. Believe it. You did this? You saved my ass. We did it. Together. They stood there in the doorway, holding on to each other, and Caleb realized he didn't want to let go. When they finally pulled apart, Vivian was smiling wider than Caleb had ever seen. Her eyes were bright, almost wet, and she wiped at them quickly with the back of her hand. Sorry, she said. I don't usually do this. Do what? Get emotional about zoning appeals. Caleb laughed. Yeah, well, it was a pretty good win. It was. She stepped back and looked at him. We should celebrate. Do something. I don't know what, but something. How about dinner? Real dinner, not just leftovers on the porch. That sounds perfect. They decided on a restaurant in town, a small Italian place Caleb used to take Mason to on special occasions. He called his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, to watch Mason for the evening. And by 6 o'clock, he and Vivian were sitting across from each other at a corner table with red checkered tablecloths and candles that flickered in glass jars. It felt like a date, though neither of them said it out loud. I can't remember the last time I went out to eat, Vivian said, looking at the menu. Like, actually sat down at a restaurant. That's depressing. Tell me about it. They ordered pasta and wine, and for the first time in weeks, the conversation didn't revolve around Mallory or inspections or appeals. They talked about other things, small things. Vivian told him about growing up in Boston, about her parents who still lived there and didn't quite understand why she'd walked away from her career. Caleb told her about Mason's mother, about how she'd left when Mason was 3 months old and never looked back. Do you ever hear from her? Vivian asked. No. She signed away her rights about a year after she left, said she wasn't cut out for being a mom. That must have been hard. It was. For a while. But then I realized Mason and I were better off without her. She didn't want to be there, and you can't force someone to care. Vivian looked down at her wine glass. No, you can't. What about you? You ever been married? Almost, once. Got engaged when I was 26, called it off 6 months before the wedding. What happened? I realized I didn't love him. I loved the idea of him, the stability, the plan, the life we were supposed to build together, but the actual person? I barely knew him. That takes guts, calling it off. Or stupidity. My mother didn't talk to me for a year after that. She's still mad? Not really, but she brings it up every time I see her, usually in the context of how I'm not getting any younger and all my friends are married with kids. Caleb smiled. Sounds fun. It's a blast. They finished their wine, and Caleb ordered another bottle, even though he probably shouldn't have. But he felt good, lighter than he had in months, and he didn't want the night to end. Can I ask you something? Vivian said after the waiter brought the second bottle. Sure. Why'd you really help me that night? The truth. Caleb thought about it. I told you, you needed help. But why did you care? Most people would have just walked past. I guess I'm not most people. That's not an answer. Caleb poured more wine into both their glasses and leaned back in his chair. When Mason's mom left, I was a mess. I didn't know what I was doing. I was 24, working a job I hated, trying to raise a baby by myself. And I kept thinking, if I could just get through this one thing, everything would be okay. But there was always another thing, and another, and I started to realize that nobody was coming to save me. I had to figure it out on my own. Vivian listened, her eyes on his. But then my boss, the guy I told you about, He helped me, Caleb continued. And it wasn't a big thing. He just let me bring Mason to work for a while, but it was enough. It gave me the breathing room I needed to figure things out. And I never forgot that. So you helped me because someone helped you. I helped you because I know what it's like to be stuck. And I didn't want you to feel like you were alone in it. Vivian didn't say anything for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his. Thank you, she said. For what? For not walking past. They stayed at the restaurant until it closed, talking and laughing and drinking too much wine. When they finally left, the night air was cold and sharp, and Caleb's head was buzzing pleasantly. I'm definitely not driving, Vivian said, leaning against the truck. Yeah, me neither. We'll walk. It's not that far. It's like 2 miles. So? You afraid of a little exercise? I'm wearing heels. Take them off. Vivian laughed and kicked off her heels, holding them in one hand. Fine. But if I step on something gross, I'm blaming you. They walked back through the quiet streets, past houses with warm lights in the windows and dogs barking behind fences. Vivian talked about her old job, about the deals she'd closed and the people she'd worked with. Some of it sounded impressive. Some of it sounded soul-crushing. Do you miss it? Caleb asked. Sometimes. But not the way I thought I would. What do you mean? I thought I'd miss the power. The feeling of walking into a room and knowing people had to listen to me. But I don't. What I miss is the clarity, knowing exactly what I was supposed to do and how to do it. And now? Now I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And it's terrifying, but also kind of freeing. They reached the house just after midnight. The lights were off except for the porch light Caleb had left on. Mrs. Patterson had already gone home, and Mason was asleep upstairs. Vivian stopped at the edge of the driveway, still holding her heels. I should probably go to bed, she said. Yeah, me too. But neither of them moved. Caleb? Yeah? Tonight was really nice, thank you. You already thanked me. I know, but I mean it. Caleb looked at her, standing there barefoot in the driveway with her hair falling out of its ponytail and her dress wrinkled from sitting too long. She looked beautiful. Not in the polished, put-together way she'd looked that morning, but in a way that felt real. You want to come inside? He asked. I can make coffee, or tea, or we can just sit. Vivian hesitated, and for a second Caleb thought she was going to say no. Then she nodded. Okay. They went inside, and Caleb made tea while Vivian sat at the kitchen table, her feet tucked under her. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. This feels normal, Vivian said. What does? This, sitting here with you, like we've been doing it for years instead of weeks. Caleb handed her a mug and sat down across from her. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know, maybe both. They drank their tea in silence, and then Vivian set down her mug and looked at him. I need to tell you something, she said. Okay. I got a call yesterday from a recruiter. One of my old contacts at Hargrave reached out. They want to bring me back. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. Back to your old job? Not exactly. A different position. Senior consultant, less travel, better hours. And the pay is, well, it's a lot. That's great. Is it? Isn't it? Vivian looked down at her hands. I don't know. A month ago, I would have said yes without thinking, but now what? Now I don't know if that's what I want anymore. Caleb didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to tell her to take the job, to go back to the life she'd had before all of this, but the other part of him wanted her to stay. What did you tell them? He asked. That I'd think about it. And are you thinking about it? Yeah, but every time I try to picture myself back in that world, all I can think about is how miserable I was. You were miserable? Not at first, but by the end? Yeah, I was. Caleb reached across the table and took her hand. Then don't go back. It's not that simple. Why not? Because I need a job, Caleb. I can't live in your guest unit forever. Why not? Vivian laughed, but it sounded sad. Because you have a life. You have Mason. You don't need some washed-up consultant crashing in your backyard. You're not washed up, and I don't mind you being here. You don't mind, or you like it? Caleb looked at her for a long moment. I like it. Vivian's breath caught just a little. Caleb, I'm not saying you have to stay forever. I'm just saying you don't have to leave because you think you're supposed to. What if I want to stay? Then stay. Vivian stared at him, and Caleb could see her trying to decide whether he meant it. Then she stood up, walked around the table, and kissed him. It wasn't a tentative kiss or a questioning one. It was the kind of kiss that said she'd been thinking about it for a while and had finally stopped talking herself out of it. Caleb kissed her back, his hands finding her waist, pulling her closer. When they finally pulled apart, Vivian was breathing hard. I shouldn't have done that, she said. Why not? Because everything's complicated enough already. So let it be complicated. Vivian laughed and rested her forehead against his. You're impossible. I've been told that before. They stayed like that for a moment, and then Vivian stepped back and ran a hand through her hair. I should go, she said. You don't have to. I know, but I should. Caleb walked her to the back door, and they stood there in the doorway, neither of them quite ready to say goodnight. I'll see you in the morning, Vivian said. Yeah, morning. She kissed him one more time, quick and soft, and then she was gone, crossing the yard to the guest unit and disappearing inside. Caleb stood there for a while, staring out at the dark yard, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then he went upstairs, checked on Mason, and lay down in bed. He didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, things were awkward. Vivian came over for coffee, and they both pretended nothing had happened. Caleb made pancakes for Mason, and Vivian read the news on her phone, and everything was perfectly normal except for the fact that it wasn't. Mason noticed immediately. Why are you guys being weird? He asked through a mouthful of pancake. We're not being weird, Caleb said. Yes, you are. You won't even look at each other. Vivian laughed. He's got you there. Caleb shot her a look, and she just grinned. After Mason left for school, Caleb and Vivian sat at the kitchen table, the silence stretching between them. So, Vivian said finally. About last night. We don't have to talk about it. I think we do. Caleb sighed. Okay, let's talk about it. I kissed you. I noticed. And you kissed me back. Also noticed. Vivian smiled. So where does that leave us? I don't know. Where do you want it to leave us? I want... She stopped, then started again. I don't know what I want. I just know I don't want to screw this up. Screw what up? This. Us. Whatever this is. Caleb reached across the table and took her hand. You're not going to screw it up. You don't know that. Yeah, I do. Because you're not the kind of person who runs when things get complicated. How do you know? Because you're still here. Vivian looked at him, and something in her expression softened. Yeah, I am. So stop worrying about what you're supposed to do and just do what feels right. And what if what feels right is staying here, with you and Mason? Then stay. It's not that simple. Why does everyone keep saying that? It is that simple. You want to stay, you stay. You want to leave, you leave. But stop acting like you owe the world an explanation. Vivian squeezed his hand. You make it sound so easy. That's because it is. They sat there for a while longer, not saying anything, just holding hands across the kitchen table. And for the first time since Vivian had shown up in the rain, Caleb felt like maybe everything was going to be okay. But then, 2 days later, everything fell apart again. Caleb was in the shop when Vivian came running across the yard, her phone in her hand and her face pale. What's wrong? Caleb asked. Mallory's lawyer just called me. Caleb's stomach dropped. What did he say? He's threatening to sue me for defamation. He says the information we gave to the city was false and that I knowingly misrepresented his business practices. That's bullshit. Everything we gave them was public record. I know, but he's claiming I fabricated parts of it, and he's threatening to go after you too. For what? For allowing me to stay here. He's saying you're harboring someone who's defaming him, and that makes you liable. Caleb wanted to punch something. He can't do that. He can try. And even if he loses, the legal fees alone could bankrupt you. Caleb sat down on the edge of his workbench, his head in his hands. This is never going to end, is it? I don't know. I can't keep fighting him, Vivian. I don't have the money. I don't have the time. I can't. Vivian knelt down in front of him and put her hands on his knees. Listen to me. Mallory's bluffing. He's pissed that we beat him at the city, and now he's trying to scare us into backing off. And what if he's not bluffing? Then we'll deal with it, together. I can't ask you to keep fighting my battles. You're not asking, I'm choosing. Caleb looked at her, at the determination in her eyes, and he felt something crack open inside him. Why are you doing this? He asked. Because you'd do the same for me. How do you know? Because I know you. Caleb pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. I'm scared. I know, me too. So what do we do? Vivian pulled back and looked at him. We call his bluff. We get a lawyer, we fight back, and we show him that we're not going anywhere. And if that doesn't work, then we'll figure out plan C. Caleb laughed despite himself. How many plans do we have? As many as it takes. They spent the rest of the day calling lawyers, trying to find someone who could help them without charging an arm and a leg. Most of the calls went nowhere. But finally, late in the afternoon, Vivian found someone, a young attorney named Sarah Chen, who specialized in tenant rights and harassment cases. She thinks we have a case, Vivian said after hanging up. Not just against Mallory, but against his whole operation. If we can prove he's been systematically harassing tenants and filing frivolous complaints, we could get him barred from filing any more. How much is this going to cost? She's willing to work on contingency. We don't pay unless we win. And if we lose? Then we're back where we started, but at least we tried. Caleb thought about it. Every instinct he had was telling him to walk away, to stop fighting and just focus on keeping his head down. But he couldn't. Not anymore. Okay, he said. Let's do it. Vivian smiled. Yeah? Yeah. They met with Sarah the next day at her office downtown. She was younger than Caleb expected, maybe 30, with short black hair and a no-nonsense attitude that reminded him of Vivian. I've reviewed the materials you sent over, Sarah said, spreading papers across her desk. And I'll be honest with you, this is a strong case. Mallory's got a clear pattern of harassment, and the fact that he's now threatening you with a defamation suit after you filed a legitimate complaint with the city, that's textbook retaliation. So we can win? Vivian asked. I think so. But it's going to take time. Guys like Mallory don't go down easy. How much time? Months, probably. Maybe longer. Caleb's heart sank. I can't afford to drag this out for months. You won't have to. Once we file a countersuit, Mallory's going to think twice about following through on his threats. And if he does, we'll bury him in discovery requests until he gives up. What if he doesn't give up? Sarah looked at Caleb. Then we go to court, and we win. But my guess? He'll fold before it gets that far. Caleb wanted to believe her, but he'd learned the hard way that guys like Mallory didn't fold easily. Still, what choice did he have? Okay, he said. Let's do it. Sarah drew up the paperwork, and within a week they'd filed a countersuit against Mallory for harassment, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit was aggressive, and Sarah made sure it was public. She sent copies to the local newspaper, to the city council, and to every tenant rights organization in the area. We're not just fighting him in court, Sarah explained. We're fighting him in the court of public opinion. Once people see what he's been doing, he's going to have a much harder time finding tenants, and that's going to hurt him where it matters, his wallet. Vivian was impressed. You're good at this. I've had a lot of practice. Guys like Mallory think they can push people around because most people don't have the resources to fight back. But you do. And we're going to make him regret ever coming after you. The response from Mallory's lawyer came 2 days later. It was brief and to the point. They were dropping the defamation threat and withdrawing all complaints against Caleb. Caleb read the letter 3 times before he believed it. He's backing off, he said, staring at the paper. He doesn't have a choice, Sarah said. We called his bluff, and he folded, just like I said he would. Vivian let out a breath. So it's over? It's over. Mallory's done. Caleb sat down heavily in his chair. I can't believe it. Believe it, Sarah said. You won. After they left Sarah's office, Caleb and Vivian walked to a coffee shop down the street. They sat outside in the sun, drinking overpriced lattes and not saying much. We actually did it, Caleb said finally. Yeah, we did. I still can't believe he just gave up. He didn't give up. He realized he couldn't win. There's a difference. Caleb looked at her. You know you're kind of amazing, right? Vivian smiled. I've been told that before. I'm serious. I wouldn't have gotten through any of this without you. Yes, you would have. You're tougher than you think. Maybe. But I'm glad I didn't have to find out. They finished their coffee and walked back to the truck. On the drive home, Caleb found himself thinking about what came next. The threat was gone. Mallory was done. But that didn't mean things were simple. So, Caleb said, what are you going to do about that job offer? Vivian looked out the window. I already told them no. You did? Yeah, yesterday. Why didn't you say anything? I don't know. I guess I was still figuring out how I felt about it. And how do you feel? Vivian turned to look at him. I feel like I made the right choice. Caleb smiled. Good. But that still leaves me with the question of what I'm going to do next. You could always stay. In your guest unit? Or in the house, if you want. Vivian laughed. Are you asking me to move in with you? Maybe. Is that crazy? A little. But is it a no? Vivian looked at him for a long moment, and then she smiled. No, it's not a no. When they got home, Mason was sitting on the front steps waiting for them. He jumped up as soon as the truck pulled into the driveway. Did you win? He asked before they even got out. Caleb looked at Vivian, then back at his son. Yeah, bud. We won. Mason let out a whoop and ran over to hug Caleb around the waist. I knew you would. How'd you know? Because you always figure things out. Caleb ruffled his son's hair, feeling something warm spread through his chest. Not always. Sometimes I need help. Mason looked up at Vivian. Is that why you're here? To help? Vivian crouched down so she was at eye level with him. Yeah, that's why I'm here. Are you going to stay? Vivian glanced at Caleb, then back at Mason. Would that be okay with you? Mason nodded seriously. Yeah, I like having you around. You're better at math homework than Dad is. Hey, Caleb protested. It's true, Mason said. You always get confused on the word problems. Vivian laughed and stood up. Well, I'm glad I can contribute something. That night they ordered pizza and ate it on the back porch while Mason told them about his day at school. Something about a kid named Tyler who'd brought a frog to class and let it loose during reading time. The way Mason told it, it sounded like complete chaos, and Caleb found himself laughing harder than he had in months. After Mason went to bed, Caleb and Vivian stayed outside, wrapped in blankets against the cold. I need to ask you something, Caleb said. Okay. What happens now, with us, I mean? Vivian pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. I don't know. What do you want to happen? I want you to stay. Not just because Mason likes having you around, or because you're good at fighting zoning appeals. I want you to stay because He stopped, not sure how to finish. Because you what? Because I don't want to go back to how things were before, when it was just me and Mason, when everything felt like I was barely holding it together. Vivian reached over and took his hand. You were holding it together fine. Maybe. But it's better with you here. Even with all the chaos I brought with me? Especially with the chaos. Vivian smiled, but there was something sad in it. I'm scared, Caleb. Of what? Of screwing this up. Of staying and then realizing I don't fit into your life. Or worse, realizing I do fit and then losing it all anyway. You're not going to lose anything. You can't promise that. No, but I can promise I'm not going anywhere. And as long as you're here, I'll do everything I can to make sure you don't want to leave. Vivian looked at him for a long moment, and then she leaned over and kissed him. It was softer than the kiss in the kitchen. More tentative, like she was still deciding whether to believe him. Okay, she said when they pulled apart. I'll stay, but we're taking this slow. How slow? Slow enough that if one of us freaks out, we can talk about it instead of running. I can do that. Good, because I'm really bad at running. They sat there for a while longer, and then Vivian went back to the guest unit. Caleb watched her go, feeling something settle inside him that he hadn't even realized was unsettled. The next few weeks were strange in the best way possible. Vivian started looking for work, sending out resumes and taking calls with recruiters. But she was pickier this time, turning down offers that didn't feel right and refusing to settle just because the money was good. Caleb didn't push her. He figured she'd find something when she was ready. In the meantime, she started helping out in the shop. Not with the woodworking, she freely admitted she didn't have the skill for that, but with the business side. She set up a proper website for him, started managing his social media, and even helped him price his work more accurately. "You've been undercharging for years," she told him one afternoon, going through his old invoices. "I charge what people can afford." "That's noble, but it's also stupid. You're leaving money on the table." "I don't do this for the money." "I know, but you need money to live, and you deserve to be compensated fairly for the work you do." Caleb didn't argue, mostly because she was right. Within a month, his income had increased by 30%. Not because he was working more, but because Vivian had figured out how to market his work to people who actually valued it. She found clients who wanted custom furniture and were willing to pay for quality. And suddenly, Caleb wasn't just scraping by anymore. He was actually making a living. "I don't know how you did this," he said one night, looking at his bank account. "It's not rocket science. You just needed someone who knows how to run a business." "Well, you're really good at it." "I know." Caleb laughed. "Modest. I spent 10 years in corporate. I'm allowed to know what I'm good at." But it wasn't just the business that was changing. It was everything. Vivian started spending more time in the main house, usually under the pretense of helping with dinner or homework. But Caleb knew it was more than that. She was testing the waters, seeing if she really could fit into their lives. And she did. Easily. Naturally. Like she'd always been there. Mason adored her. He'd come home from school and go looking for her before he even said hello to Caleb. They'd sit at the kitchen table doing homework together, Vivian patiently explaining fractions while Mason doodled in the margins of his notebook. "You're really good with him," Caleb said one evening after Mason had gone to bed. "He's a good kid, makes it easy." Still, not everyone would have that kind of patience. Vivian shrugged. "I like kids. I just never thought I'd have any of my own." "Why not?" "Because I was too busy climbing the corporate ladder. And by the time I realized I wanted something different, I'd already burned most of my bridges." "You could still have kids." "Maybe, but I don't know if I'd be any good at it." "You're good with Mason." "That's different. He's yours. There's no pressure." Caleb looked at her. "If there was pressure, you'd handle it. You handle everything." Vivian smiled, but she didn't say anything. About 6 weeks after Mallory's lawsuit collapsed, Vivian got a call from a company in Seattle. They were a tech startup focused on sustainable housing, and they wanted to bring her on as head of operations. The pay was excellent, the mission aligned with her values, and they were willing to let her work remotely most of the time. It was, by all accounts, the perfect job. "I don't know what to do," Vivian said that night, sitting on the couch in Caleb's living room. "What do you mean? It sounds great." "It is great. That's the problem." "I don't follow." Vivian set down her wine glass and turned to face him. "If I take this job, everything changes. I'll have to travel sometimes. I'll be on calls at weird hours. I won't be able to help in the shop as much." "So, you'd still be here." "Would I, though? Or would I just be living here while my life is somewhere else?" Caleb thought about it. "I guess that depends on what you want your life to be." "I don't know what I want. That's the problem. A few months ago, I would have taken this job without thinking twice, but now what? Now I have this." She gestured around the room. "You and Mason, the shop, dinner on the porch. It's not what I planned, but it's good. And I don't know if I want to give that up for a job, even a good one." Caleb reached over and took her hand. "You don't have to give it up. We'll make it work." "You say that now. But what happens when I'm traveling 3 weeks out of the month and you're here alone with Mason? What happens when you need help and I'm in Seattle at a conference? Then we'll figure it out together." "You keep saying that." "Because it's true. Vivian, I don't want you to turn down a good opportunity because you're worried about us. We'll be fine. And if we're not, we'll talk about it and adjust." Vivian looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded. "Okay, I'll take the job." "Yeah?" "Yeah, but I'm holding you to that. If this doesn't work, we talk about it." "Deal." She started the job 2 weeks later, and for a while, everything was fine. Better than fine, actually. Vivian thrived in the role, throwing herself into the work with the same intensity she'd brought to fighting Mallory. And Caleb was proud of her. He liked seeing her excited about something again, liked hearing her talk about the projects she was working on and the people she was helping. But he'd be lying if he said it wasn't hard. There were nights when Vivian was on calls until midnight, and Caleb would go to bed alone, listening to her voice through the walls. There were mornings when she'd leave before Mason woke up, catching an early flight to some meeting on the other side of the country. And there were weekends when Caleb had planned something, a hike, a trip to the zoo, only to have Vivian cancel because work needed her. He didn't complain. He'd told her they'd make it work, and he meant it, but it was wearing on him. Mason noticed too. "Where's Vivian?" he asked one Saturday morning when she was supposed to come over for breakfast. "She had to work." "Again?" "Yeah, again." Mason pushed his cereal around his bowl, not eating. "Does she not want to hang out with us anymore?" "Of course she does. She's just busy." "She's always busy." Caleb didn't know what to say to that because it was true. That night, after Mason was asleep, Caleb texted Vivian. "We need to talk." She called him 5 minutes later. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing's wrong. I just think we need to check in." "Okay. About what?" Caleb took a breath. "About whether this is working." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Are you saying it's not working?" Vivian asked finally. "I'm saying it's hard, and I don't think either of us expected it to be this hard." "Caleb, I'm doing my best. I know you are, but Mason asked me today if you still want to hang out with us, and I didn't know what to tell him." Another silence. "I do want to hang out with you guys," Vivian said, and her voice sounded thick. There's so much work, and I'm still trying to prove myself, and I don't know how to balance it all." "Then maybe you need to figure that out, because right now it feels like you're choosing the job over us. That's not fair." "Maybe not, but it's how it feels." Vivian didn't say anything for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was small. "I don't want to lose you guys." "Then don't. But you need to decide what matters more, the job or this." "Why does it have to be one or the other?" "It doesn't, but you need to find a way to make both work. And right now, it's not working." They hung up without really resolving anything, and Caleb went to bed feeling like he'd just made a huge mistake. The next morning, Vivian showed up at the house before breakfast. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept. "I quit," she said as soon as Caleb opened the door. "What?" "I quit the job. I called my boss last night and told him I couldn't do it anymore." Caleb stared at her. "Vivian, you didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. Because you were right. I was choosing the job over you guys, and that's not what I want." "But that was a good job. You loved it." "I liked it, but I didn't love it. And I don't want to spend the rest of my life chasing something I only like when I could be here with people I actually care about." Caleb didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," Vivian said, "for making you feel like you weren't a priority. You are. You and Mason both." Caleb pulled her into a hug, holding her tight. "You didn't have to quit." "Yeah, I did, because this," she gestured between them, "this is what matters, not some job in Seattle." Mason appeared in the doorway, still in his pajamas. "Are you staying for breakfast?" Vivian pulled back from Caleb and smiled at him. "Yeah, I'm staying for breakfast." "Good, because Dad's pancakes are better when you're here." "How are they better?" "I don't know. They just are." After breakfast, Vivian and Caleb sat on the back porch while Mason played in the yard. The air was cool, but the sun was warm, and for the first time in weeks, Caleb felt like everything was going to be okay. "So, what are you going to do now?" he asked. "I don't know. Figure it out, I guess." "You could always go back to consulting. On your own terms this time." "Maybe. Or maybe I'll do something completely different." "Like what?" "I don't know. Open a bakery, become a dog walker, join the circus." Caleb laughed. "You'd be terrible at all of those things." "Probably, but I'd have fun trying." They sat in silence for a while, and then Vivian turned to him. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. Why did you let me stay?" "Really? You could have just let me crash for a night and sent me on my way. But you didn't. Why?" Caleb thought about it. "Because I saw you kneeling in the rain trying to save those books, and I thought, here's someone who's not giving up. Even when everything's falling apart, she's still fighting. And I guess I wanted to help someone like that. And now? Now I don't want you to leave. Not because I feel sorry for you or because I think you need help, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Vivian's eyes filled with tears, and she wiped them away quickly. That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. It's true. She leaned over and kissed him, and this time there was no hesitation. No doubt. Just the two of them, sitting in the sun, figuring out what came next. A few weeks later, Vivian moved out of the guest unit and into the main house. It wasn't a big production, just her clothes and her laptop and a few boxes of books. But it felt significant. Like she was finally admitting this was home. Mason helped her unpack, carrying boxes up the stairs and asking a million questions about where everything should go. Are you going to sleep in Dad's room? He asked. Vivian glanced at Caleb, who just shrugged. Sometimes, yeah. Okay, just don't be loud. I need to sleep. Caleb laughed. Noted. That night, after everything was unpacked and Mason was asleep, Caleb and Vivian lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. This is weird, right? Vivian said. A little. Good. I'm glad it's not just me. Caleb turned on his side to face her. Are you happy? Yeah, I am. Are you? Yeah. Even with all the chaos? Especially with the chaos. Vivian smiled and rolled over to face him. You know, when I showed up here that night in the rain, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd lost everything. And now? Now I think maybe I found something better. They lay there in the dark, not saying anything, just being together. And Caleb realized that this quiet, ordinary moment was exactly what he'd been missing all along. It wasn't perfect. Vivian still had days where she missed her old life, where she wondered if she'd made the right choice. And Caleb still had moments where he worried that one day she'd wake up and realize she'd settled for something less than she deserved. But they talked about it. They worked through it. And slowly, they built something real. Vivian started freelance consulting, taking on clients who shared her values and working from home so she could still be around for Mason. Caleb's business continued to grow, and between the two of them, they were making enough to be comfortable. Not rich, but comfortable. And that was enough. Mason thrived. He did better in school, smiled more, asked fewer worried questions about whether everything was going to be okay. Because for the first time in his life, it felt like it was. One night, about 6 months after Vivian had moved in, Caleb found her sitting on the back porch, staring out at the dark yard. What are you thinking about? He asked, sitting down next to her. Just how different everything is now. Good different or bad different? Good. Definitely good. You sure? Vivian turned to look at him. When I left Hargrave, I thought I was giving up everything. My career, my reputation, my future. And for a while it felt like I had. But then I ended up here with you and Mason, and I realized I hadn't given up anything. I just made room for something better. You think we're better than a corner office and a 6-figure salary? I know you are, Caleb smiled. That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. Don't get used to it. They sat there for a while longer, and then Caleb said, I love you. Vivian looked at him, her eyes wide. What? I love you. I probably should have said it sooner, but I'm saying it now. Vivian's face softened, and she reached over to take his hand. I love you too. Yeah? Yeah. They kissed, and it felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else all at once. A year later, Vivian and Caleb were sitting in the same spot on the back porch, watching Mason play in the yard. The guest unit had been converted into a proper office for Vivian, and the shop was busier than ever. They'd added a second workbench, and Caleb had started training an apprentice, a kid from town who reminded him a lot of himself at that age. You ever think about how things could have gone differently? Vivian asked. Sometimes, but not in a bad way, more like, I'm grateful they went the way they did. Me too. Mason ran over, breathless and covered in dirt. Dad, can we have a fire tonight and make s'mores? Sure, bud. Go get the wood from the shed. Mason ran off, and Vivian smiled. He's happy. Yeah, he is. So are you. Yeah, I am. Vivian leaned her head on Caleb's shoulder. You know what I learned from all this? What? That sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you ends up being the best thing, because it forces you to rebuild. And when you rebuild, you get to choose what kind of life you want, instead of just accepting the one you fell into. Caleb thought about that. You think that's true for everyone? I don't know. But it was true for me. For me too. They sat there in the fading light, watching Mason gather wood for the fire, and Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the kind that came from having everything figured out, but the kind that came from knowing that whatever happened next, they'd face it together. Because that was the thing about life. It wasn't about avoiding chaos or controlling every outcome. It was about finding people who'd stand with you when things fell apart, and then building something new out of the wreckage. Caleb had spent so many years trying to keep everything together on his own, afraid that if he let anyone in, they'd just leave. But Vivian had taught him that letting someone in didn't make you weaker. It made you stronger. Because the weight you carried alone was crushing, but the weight you carried together was manageable. And maybe that was the point, not to have a perfect life, but to have a real one, with real people who made real mistakes and stayed anyway. Later that night, after the fire had burned down to embers and Mason had fallen asleep on the couch, Caleb carried him up to bed. When he came back downstairs, Vivian was cleaning up the s'mores supplies, humming to herself. "You don't have to do that," Caleb said. "I know, but I want to." He walked over and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Thank you." "For what?" "For staying, for fighting, for choosing this." Vivian turned in his arms and looked up at him. "I didn't choose this in spite of everything that happened. I chose it because of everything that happened. Because you showed me what it looks like when someone actually shows up, not just once, but every single day. You show up too. I'm trying to. You're doing more than trying. You're here. That's what matters." They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other, and Caleb thought about the night Vivian had shown up in the rain. How he'd almost walked past her, how easily he could have stayed in his workshop and ignored what was happening across the driveway. But he hadn't. He'd stepped out into the storm, and that one decision had changed everything. Not because it was heroic or special, but because it was human. Because he'd seen someone who needed help and decided to help them, even when it was inconvenient, even when it complicated his life. And in return, Vivian had helped him. Not just with Mallory or the business or the legal mess, but with the much harder work of learning to let someone in, of learning that being vulnerable wasn't the same as being weak. That was what they'd given each other. Not perfection or certainty or an easy path forward, but the courage to keep trying. The knowledge that they didn't have to face anything alone. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees. Caleb could hear it whistling around the corners of the house, the same way it had that night when everything started. But this time, he wasn't standing in the doorway wondering what came next. He was home, with Vivian, with Mason asleep upstairs, with a business that was finally stable and a future that felt possible. It wasn't perfect. There would be hard days ahead, bills that were tight, arguments that needed resolving, uncertainty that couldn't be avoided. But they'd figure it out, together. Because that was what love was, Caleb had learned. Not finding someone who made your life easy, but finding someone who made the hard parts worth it. And Vivian was worth it. Every fight with Mallory, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. She was worth all of it. He kissed the top of her head, and she squeezed him tighter. "I'm glad you didn't walk past me that night," Vivian said quietly. "Me too." "Do you think you would have? If things had been different?" Caleb thought about it. "I don't know. Maybe. But I'm glad I didn't." "What do you think would have happened to me if you had?" "You would have figured it out. You always do." "Maybe. But it would have taken a lot longer, and it would have been a lot lonelier." Caleb pulled back just enough to look at her. "Well, you're not alone anymore. And you're not going to be." Vivian smiled, and there were tears in her eyes, but they were the good kind. The kind that came from relief and gratitude and the realization that sometimes, against all odds, things actually worked out. They finished cleaning up and went upstairs. Caleb checked on Mason one more time, pulling the blanket up over his shoulders and smoothing his hair back from his forehead. His son looked peaceful, content, and that was all Caleb had ever wanted for him. When he got back to the bedroom, Vivian was already in bed, reading something on her phone. She looked up when he came in. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, everything's good." Caleb climbed into bed next to her, and she turned off the light. They lay there in the dark, not talking, just existing in the same space. And Caleb realized that this was it. This was the life he'd been working toward all along, even when he didn't know it, Not some grand achievement or perfect moment, just this: the quiet comfort of being with someone who knew him and stayed anyway. That night, Caleb fell asleep with Vivian's hand in his, and for the first time in years, he didn't wake up at 4 in the morning worrying about what came next. Because whatever came next, they'd face it together. And that was enough.